Hello everyone and welcome to Tortoise's digital newsroom. As you remember, before COVID-19 we used to get together in our newsroom. We opened the door to our office in London in East Castle Street and asked everyone to join us. And the idea was that we wanted to have an open newsroom informed by our members, by people with a set of expertise and experiences, and by guests who could help us understand better what was happening in the news and perhaps point us to stories that we were missing. And strangely enough, one of the things that's been transformed by the coronavirus has been that sense of openness, the extent to which we can truly have an open journalism that's informed by our members, by people all over the world and with genuinely different points of view. And you kind of feel as though it couldn't have come too soon, given what's happening in the world, given that we are meeting today as George Floyd is being buried in the United States, as we're seeing a crisis of confidence in the UK government and its handling of the coronavirus, as the world seems more separated in its experience of what was thought to be a global crisis, but now seems to be extremely different within countries and between them. And so the hope in this next hour is that we try to operate as we would in a normal newsroom, think, okay, what's the stories? What's the angle to these stories? What is the approach that we should take? And do so in the way in which a normal newsroom does, which is that everyone voices what they think, tests their opinions, shares what they've heard, what they've experienced, so that we can try to come to a better understanding of these stories. In the spirit of that open journalism, we have an open news list. My colleague and fellow editor Basha Cummings has produced an open news list. Some weeks we've had long ones. This week we've had actually one that's particularly focused on the issues that I mentioned, because it seems that there is a cultural argument that is raging about the UK and its history. There's an argument about corporate politics and signalling, and there's an argument about lived injustice in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And at the same time, there is a big set of questions about which governments are handling the coronavirus well. It turns out they are mostly, if not all, run by women, and which ones are not, and why, and to try and understand what it is in government that's working and what's not. But if you've got an idea for a story, if you've got an idea for the way that we should be covering the story, this is really the chance to weigh in. And there are two really simple ways of doing that. One is just type it on the chat. Many of you I can see are already weighing in. My colleague Liz Mosley, who's a fellow editor and partner at Tortoise, there she is waving at you and typing at you both at the same time, almost miraculously. And then the other thing is, if you know a little bit about Zoom, you'll know that if you're a participant, you can just hit the participants tab, you can hit the little button that says raise your hand, and then you can flag a blue digital hand to me and say hi, you want to speak up, and I'll bring you into the conversation. We want to start. Actually, I'm not gonna sort of push, because we've asked Nimco Ali and Hannah Rose Woods to join us. Nimco Ali, you know, she's been at one of our ThinkIns before. We've talked before. Hello, Nimco. It's really nice to see you. You in our ThinkIns back in our newsroom. And Hannah Rose Woods is a cultural historian. But Nimco, actually, before we get to one of the subjects that's on our mind, which is statues, culture, education. As we were just getting onto this call, I asked you how your lockdown has been, whether it's been sort of frustrating, interesting, or productive, interesting. And you had such an interesting answer to that. I thought that I'd tee that off and ask you how you've experienced it and what your views are as a result of the last couple of months.
Yeah, I think interesting is a very British word, which is very diplomatic. So as I was saying, the reality is that I started a foundation called the Five Foundation, which ultimately is trying to advocate for putting power back in the hands of African women, specifically around the issue of FGM, and doing that through economic empowerment. One of the key things is that our philosophy of saying that grassroots activism is the way to change communities and change lives is really showing, because of the COVID outbreak. A lot of the large NGOs are pulling out, but that pulling out means that the needs are still there. So FGM is going up, early forced marriage is going up, food insecurity. So post-COVID, we're going to have a very fragile and very risky lives in Africa at the moment. And for me, one of the things that I'm really concerned about is actually China's role in Africa over the last 2 decades and how silent we've been about that. So yeah, it's been really interesting. It's been really heartbreaking because if girls are cut, they can't be uncut. If girls are sold into child marriage, they are going to be having more children. So real poverty and hunger is awakening. And with the growth of the right wing extremists that don't necessarily want to be funding in international development aid, and other people that think that we should be doing aid in a way which is a little bit counterproductive to what Africans are doing, I'm really concerned. And I think that's something that we haven't spoken about in the news or anything else like that. So that's why I'm not necessarily that emotional over a statue knocking down, because if we really do say we care about Black lives, a lot of the lives that really at risk and are being affected by COVID are Black lives, and they just happen to be in Africa.
And it sort of doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive to think that at the moment where we've been shown more vividly than ever the way in which what happens in one country affects those of us living in another, that you're seeing this decline in spending. I wasn't clear about NGOs pulling out. Can you just tell us a little more in detail about which ones are pulling out and for what reasons and where?
So one of the key things is that because of the stay-at-home alerts, a lot of these NGOs who have Western employees that are working in countries or leading projects are being taken back to the UK or taken back to their home countries, or being taken back, being asked to go back to capital cities where the need is not there. So there's probably going to be a massive saturation of NGOs workers in Nairobi, in Addis, and all these other cities, which again is going to have an issue in terms of, like, space and food security and the ability to socially distance. And then ultimately, because people are not giving as much as they would have, a lot of the NGOs are not getting the money. So Oxfam specifically has pulled out of 18 countries at the moment, fully pulled out of 18 countries. And I know as soon as COVID is over, a lot of NGOs will come out and say that they need more funding. But I really think that we have to really question how our 0.7%, which I'm 100% committed to, we should not be thinking about cutting aid, but we should be thinking about redirecting aid. And a peaceful and prosperous Africa, one where we empower women, is one that allows us to be safe and secure on this side of the world. Because when hunger and war comes, so there's terrorism, extremism, and then also a lot of people that are going to be leaving the continent of Africa and coming to our shores, creating a lot of the upset that we see within the right-wing media. So I think our ability to spend aid is consistent and needs to be done for our own security. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's definitely nothing wrong with linking aid to the UK's peace and prosperity, because we have to do that. It's our tax dollars, and if it keeps us safe, it keeps us safe. But at the moment, if you think about it, for me, it's really detrimental that only 2% of all international development aid funding gets to the front line. Like, we spend 14 billion every year, and we're actually a little bit too racist and sexist to say that we're going to give it to African women. We're just giving it to these massive NGOs, which have massive overheads.
Well, we had, I don't know whether you were joined us that evening, Nimco. I don't think so. We had Ruth Davidson join us. This was about 4 weeks ago now.
Yeah.
And, as well as her job as a member of the Scottish Parliament, she's working with the Halo Trust, and their argument, or their concern about what was happening, was that even though the government was still saying it was meeting its targets on overall distribution of aid money, most of it was going to these big multilateral institutions, places like the UN, and it wasn't reaching organizations on the front line. So I'm interested to know, but specifically, if you take the Five Foundation and people say, look, we want to see if we can make an active, meaningful, tangible difference, what would you want people to do?
So we've just set up a cooperative fund with Global Fund for Women, which actually has 30 years experience of funding women on the front line. And I really want to say that the UK government at the moment is doing incredible work. It's not the UK government and its commitment to 0.7%, but ultimately it's about civil servants and the way that DFID works. It's very problematic. It says that it cares about eradicating GM, ending child mortality, all these things. But again, the way it's doing is that because it assumes that people like us want us to know where every single penny goes, that they are given to multilaterals and organizations that don't do as incredible work as the Halo Trust. As somebody that's from Somaliland, Halo Trust it's about to demine Somaliland, one of the first countries to be clear of landmines that they're working on. So small organizations that actually train locals and work with local communities is the way to go. And I think a lot of our current ministers and Secretary of States agree with that, but I think it's the system within our international development sector which ironically has a lot of well-meaning people on the left that's doing the most detrimental, harmful things to Black people, and most of those being in the developing world.
And then, forgive me, can you just explain that 2% number?
So basically, so 2% of international development funding actually finds its way to the front line. So to basically community and small organizations. And if you look at these massive NGOs, they will tell you at the bottom that for every pound you deliver, every pound that's donated to them, about 90 to 80% of it goes to overheads. And those overheads are not necessarily things that are actually helping to contribute to addressing the issues that they want to address. So we have to be a little bit, we have to think differently. It's like the whole point is that if you were running a business and for 30 years, like Save the Children has been going for 100 years. It's quite problematic to me that our organization is going for 100 years but hasn't addressed the issue. It's like we don't have another 100 years in order to end FGM. We don't even have a decade now in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But in order for us to do that, we have to think differently. And there are some incredible people that work within the aid industry, but I just need them to understand that they might need to step back and actually really hand power over to mostly women on the continent of Africa.
So I think, look, I mean, we don't have anyone from Save the Children who can sort of account for how they spend, because I know, I remember.
I'm just saying, but they've been going for 100 years. It's like you can't celebrate 100 years of running a development agency, which the problem is still getting worse and worse every day.
So I see that, Nimco. I suppose there are a couple of issues. One is trying to understand whether or not the structural spend into Africa, into African countries and communities is really working, and whether or not that 2% you mentioned, how we understand that. And there's a second bit, of course, which is the overheads and the inefficiency. So, I mean, we'll pick up and let's come back and talk to that, because I can see lots of people who are already commenting in the chat on what you're saying. Can we go though? I was really sort of struck by the extent to which, and I wasn't exactly sure what you were saying. Edward Colston, is your view you don't want the statue pulled down, or that's fine to pull the statue down, but let's not have that eclipse what really matters, which is living Black people and those actual Black lives?
Yeah, it's like, I'm not emotional over a statue being pulled down, and I'm not emotional about a statue being there. Having grown up in Bristol, having walked past the statue several times, like knowing Colston Girls' School, everything else, it's not something that I have an emotional reaction to. And the irony is that I've spent the last few weeks, actually, even before the conversation with what happened in America, really educating myself about the institutional issues in America and racism in America, because I might be Black, but I'm African, and I've said a lot of really ignorant things. And having become friends with a few African American people that were living here in London, we started to have conversations about real privilege and real issues. And one of the things that has always been very interesting to me is that everybody talks about Obama as being the first Black president. Obama was not an African-American president. Obama did not have the structural history that Michelle Obama has. So he, like me, as an African that went to America, or African that came to the UK, came with an inherent privilege on not being oppressed. So I think had Obama been an African-American, raised and understood about, like, live the realities that Michelle Obama lived, the anger and the trauma that does to you, I don't think he would have been able to be the president of the United States. So for me, when I go to America not as a Black person through the history of the American Black civil rights movement. I go to America as an African that can only listen and try to understand. And that's what I've been doing. And very few people are seeing George Ferguson's death as a moment to listen and to really understand what's going on. So the people of Haiti, the people of like the South in America, the people of the Caribbean, they have real, issues and trauma that they're living with. And if those are the experience of those people in those countries about statues, yes, I get that. But there are very few people who are directly descendants in the United Kingdom from slaves that are actually having these conversations that we're having at the moment. And I think it's been hijacked for another political narrative, which is not important to
it's
us.
not important, but do you think that there is a value, not on the specifics necessarily of, you know, I'm interested to say you're not emotional about Edward Colston, but there is a value in a much more self-aware UK thinking about its history and the people and the names that are around it. Because there is, we had a discussion like this in IMCO a week ago, and one of the very first things that came up was this sense that we were treating, you know, what was happening in the police in Minneapolis, what was happening in terms of race in America, as something on the other side of the Atlantic. And part of the conversation was, we need to get uncomfortable with our privilege, but we need to get uncomfortable with the history of, in terms of race and empire, and also our own education system. And I'm interested to know whether or not you think that's a diversion or a nice to have, but not as urgent as the things you're talking about.
It's not a diversion, and I have to kind of set this within the context again. I say this as an African person who was raised by a mother who actually had no understanding of racism towards had never experienced racism towards Black people in her lived experience until she was in her late 30s, because then she, like, you know, started to wear the headscarf in a certain way, and there were certain issues with her thing. But I look at my niece and I look at my little cousins who are the second generation to be born here in the UK, and their perception and their identity as British Black people is completely different to that of mine.
Yes,
like,
yeah.
I really don't get offended when I'm confronted with people, like, you know, white English people that say ignorant stuff. I take it as an opportunity to have a conversation and educate them, because I say, like, you know, when somebody asks me where I'm from, I say I'm a British Somali, and it's one of those things. But at the same time, to feel uncomfortable and to educate yourself is different to me than for me to help you to stop feeling guilty about things. I can't do anything about that. And also the racial makeup and the context of the United Kingdom to America is completely different.
Yeah.
We have to understand, and I accept that this is an Anglo-Saxon white country mostly. So the idea that I would demand certain things as, like, you know, from the United Kingdom, that I would not demand, like, you know, that I demand from America, it's completely different. America is a nation of immigrants. America is, like, you know, the First Nations people of America need to be reconciled. They're the people that really need to be able to be supported and have understanding, the Aboriginals in Australia. So it's this whole point, it's like, we have to have empathy with other people in order for us to have empathy with us. So as a Black person, there is no way I'm going to start telling white English people that this is my country, because I just don't feel that sense of ownership. And therefore, I'm not going to get an emotional reaction over a statue about slavery on a continent where we were complicit in. And that's another thing I really need people to understand. It wasn't just about white people coming to Africa and enslaving Black people. Those slaves were sold by other Black people or other Africans. To this, like right now as I speak, there are Africans being sold by other Africans in Libya. So I really don't also want to absorb my like, you know, ancestors from the despicable inhumanity they have committed and they are still committing. So I find you guys feel guilty about 300 years ago, but that's a lived experience right now in Africa. And I can say, as an East African, my people were selling my people. So again, we have to be in that broader context of, like, it wasn't just white people that profited of slavery. And also, we just don't have the energy to make you feel better. If you feel guilty, educate yourself and do that. But let's not spend all day talking about a statue and fabricating emotional outrage, which is not doing anything for the real slaves and the real people that are oppressed today.
Nimco, thank you. I'm going to come, if I might, to Hannah Rose Woods in one moment, who's a cultural historian, has written a lot about this. But Nacho Morris, I see that your hand's up. And so, Nacho, do you want to, I don't know whether you're reacting to something that Nimco was just saying. Oh, for some reason you're muted, Nacho, I can't hear you. No, I'm sorry, I can't hear. You know, I'm going to go to Hannah and then I'm going to come back and see if we can hear from you. Sorry about that, Nacho, I don't know exactly why that is. Hannah Rosewoods.
Hi.
What's your view? I saw that just as we were getting together to hold this thinking, that Sadiq Khan has been saying that they're going to review all statues and their slave histories in London and all street names. So there is clearly a big conversation. This is definitely not, as our sense maker today pointed out, going to end with a single statue of Edward Colston. So give us some context that we can think about this in.
I mean, first off, I agree with Nimco that we have bigger problems than statues at the moment. And I do wonder if continuing to spin a morally kind of outraged debate about it is the best use of our time. But I think what I would like to speak to is the symbolism of statues. And I think if we can't unpick the symbolic legacy of racism in Britain, it's a pretty poor indicator of the hope we have to tackle structural racism. And I think, you know, we absolutely have to try to get to a point where we are not so exercised about a group of people pulling down one statue of a slave owner. But, you know, I think it's absolutely to be celebrated that we are launching a review into you know, the kind of legacy of slavery and racism in the built environment. But can I speak to the Colston statue?
Yes, please do, yeah.
You know,
yeah.
I think it is really important that we don't, at every point in this debate, spin it out into kind of, where will this end? You know, we can't control what future generations are going to make of history. We can't control what people in the future will find offensive and unacceptable. But what we can do is focus on agreeing what is unacceptable now. Do we want an anachronistic statue of a slave trader that was not, you know, Edward Colston, you know, 174 years after his death at the beginning of the 18th century, the statue was put up. So it was erected in 1895. You know, it's not even a product of Edward Colston's time. It itself was a product of historical revisionism. You know, the 1890s was a time of deep anxiety about the future of empire. And, you know, it was a time when people held, you know, deeply eugenicist, social Darwinist views about Anglo-Saxon supremacy. And these aren't even just issues about, you know, the empire abroad. You know, these theories and these pseudoscientific ideas that were themselves brand new at the time. You know, it wasn't somehow a kind of age-old legacy of racism that we inherited. You know, these theories were being applied to working class people in Britain too. So the solution to all these anxieties about degeneration and decline and whether Britain would be able to maintain its empire into the future, the solution to that for imperialists was to kind of retrofit a narrative of English history that kind of culminated in the empire as the kind of fulfillment of Anglo-Saxon destiny. And these issues, you know, caused a real reassertion of, you know, like a racist legacy in Britain. And I don't see why we want to uphold late 19th century anxieties about empire. I don't see why that would be the one thing that we enshrine in the built environment for time immemorial.
It's so interesting, Hannah, because when we started discussing this yesterday, one of the things we were touching upon, and we held actually a ThinkIn a year and a bit ago, just as we were starting, before we even launched, one of our trials was about exactly this issue when there was such a debate around the Confederate soldiers, Confederate generals on horseback in cities, mostly in the South. And it was that bizarre discovery that they weren't put up there in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. A lot of them were put up in and around the Voting Rights Act in 1965, that they were political statements themselves, not, if you like, they're not the associations we generally have with them. And I'm going to come back to you one second just to continue that point, but I'd really like to bring in Professor Lucy Hoberman, or is it Huberman or Hoberman? I'm going to pronounce it wrong. I should probably just call you Professor, would probably be a better thing. Hello, Professor, what do you make of this? Well, I'm hoping have we got another.
No, I'm fine.
There you are. Hello.
Sorry, just
Lucy's fine.
Okay, thank you.
I'm not going to talk about the statues for too long, but I do think in my lifetime, many statues have been pulled down, and significantly, I remember watching when Saddam Hussein was pulled down.
Yes.
I think they serve some kind of, it does serve symbolic purpose. I know it's really not the only thing to be going on at all, but I suppose for some people it is a huge release, and the pictures go around the world, and it adds to a certain understanding that change is due. But I just really wanted to say something else, which is that all of the things people are talking about are fairly important, but it all needs addressing. That the syllabus in schools in the UK is not adequate. University teaching and representation and diversity is not adequate. Composition of newsrooms may not be adequate. Certainly media in this country, I'm talking about television, that's my career before I went to Warwick University. We had a broadcasting act in the 80s under Thatcher, strangely enough, that enabled point of view television to emerge. It changed the rules about impartiality, and it allowed this new station, Channel 4, and others to make programs from specific points of view. And it ushered in an incredible range of voices, primarily on Channel 4, that was very much a minority channel. And I wish they'd just repeat it all now, by filmmakers who'd never had access. So they were lesbian and gay, Latin American, Black and ethnic minority, all sorts of people, right wing, left wing. And it was a much healthier, I think it was a much healthier, although strange for some reason under Thatcher, debate, I think because there was so much to protest as well at that time in the UK. And we seem to have lost that range of point of view on media. And in fact, when anybody, thinking about Martha Carney and particular issues at the BBC, but when people do start speaking passionately, at the moment, the government is getting very, very edgy. And I'm reading much, much more detailed reporting, say, of COVID-19. I mean, very, very difficult reading from the USA, which I don't understand. I don't know if it's the style of journalism they have over there, or how I don't know how our media is working here. But I do think we have lost, in general, as a society, for all voices and minorities, a great sort of richness that I don't feel has been around since
those early days of Channel 4.
Yeah.
Lucy, thank you very much. Well, and you're completely right to call it out and point it out in media and newsrooms. Nacho Moraes, let's give you another try and just see whether that.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you loud.
Perfect, thank you very much. So I wanted to talk about the statue of Colson. I think there are two items that we should explore in this context. One is that the rule of the mob versus the rule of law. The thing is that, okay, they took down the Colson statue, but what if they take down the Churchill statue because of his opinion on the Indians, or they took down the Millicent Fawcett statue because she sacrificed working class women rights for middle class women voting rights? Or what if they even burn Buckingham Palace because it's not a democratic institution? The thing is that where do you stop? I wanted to put the example of Spain. In Spain, obviously, we have a rich heritage of dictatorship for the Francoism. And what was done was there was a historical memory law that was approved that basically banned all these, all the symbols, all the street names, all the statues that refer to the regime. And for instance, my parents' street was renamed. The square where I had my first job was renamed, and many statues were taken, and even the body, the corpse of Franco was taken out of the mausoleum.
And Nacho, can you just say, let's talk about that, because we commissioned a piece particularly about the moving of Franco's body. Sorry, I don't know why my screen's gone. Sorry. that seemed to us to be powerful and important. So surely the argument is that the change in the way in which places and names are used does tell you something about the contemporary values of the society you live in. I just want to know whether what you think is the change of names to the square or your street was a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, the thing is that many people thought that basically it was not a priority, and in some cases it was a distraction. One debate that merits is that should we be erasing our history? The thing is that, for instance, in my hometown, there is a statue of Emperor Octavius Augustus that probably didn't have the best opinions on slavery, etc. Should we take it down as well? The thing is that should we just paint our history pink and just keep the things that are trendy or the values of the moment? The thing is that should we just erase Henry VIII? Should we erase Oliver Cromwell because of what he did, for instance, in Ireland?
So I'm gonna bring in some other people because I do see the point. I suppose. Well, let's hear some different points of view, but to test that, because I appreciate there is the kind of how do you measure it, where does it go, what do you deal with more complicated individuals in history. But I do also think that our public spaces are statements about who we are, and so I completely understand the meaning and the importance that people attach to the names and figures that are around them every day. I'm going to bring in a couple of people.
But it's important that it's done through the rule of law, not
so
through the rule of the mob.
Let's come back to that in a second, if that's all right. Amel, Amel Kalbul is there. Hey, Amel, how are you?
I'm good.
Very nice. It's like a reunion. I haven't seen you since ThinkIn either. Very nice to see you. So what do you make of this?
Finally, I can always participate because it's virtual, so more inclusive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I was so excited and happy about it, and I know the whole controversy around it. It reminded me, I was part of the government of Tunisia after the Arab Spring, so and getting Tunisia's transformation happening, and one of the Ben Ali, the dictator statues, was taken down with ropes, and probably it was kind of a personal feeling going back there, and it's a form of, for us in Tunisia, it was like a form of freeing yourself from some part of history, because it was also in a very prominent place, and there have been discussion about that statue before, which I think in the Bristol was also the case. It's kind of has been conversation before. Now, does it mean now you have to take all statues down? I don't know. Like there was in Tunisia, for example, they use the color violet and purple a lot, and so people started saying, "Oh, you should use that color," and I was like, no, I'm gonna use this color because I'm gonna regain it for myself. I can re-own things that dictators used, and or people I think had bad historical background. So taking that statue down doesn't mean taking all statues down. I think that's a historic moment, and I love Banksy's idea of saying, okay, take him out, put ropes around him, and put bronze statue of people who took him down, and kind of recreate that statue in a moment like it brings it a historic event. So I love that, and maybe as an external view, I'm still new in Britain in a way, and I came to this country because I felt it was inclusive. Really, like we had a choice to move anywhere we wanted in Europe, and we wanted to stay in Europe. And when I used to enter, so I'm Muslim Arab woman, when I used to enter the borders and see, these border police with headscarf, hijab, or with Sikh, turbans, and I thought this is amazing. I loved it because I felt I have two daughters to raise, and I felt in this country I could raise them to be both kind of not being defensive about who they are, I mean, sadly, since we moved here, Brexit has been happening, and many other things are happening. I'm not sure if we chose the wrong timing, or maybe it is the right timing. I don't know.
But your overwhelming feeling is that actually this kind of thing, the pulling down of a statue like this, as you said, it made you happy. You were pleased to see it.
Yeah, in a way, yes.
Okay.
Because I thought but in its own context, you know,
Yes.
of what is happening now. It's created actually a historic moment, you know, in itself, you know.
Okay, so
doesn't mean we have to take all 5,000 other statues down, you know. Yeah.
Amel, thank you. I'm going to, if I can, I just want to go back to Nimco, because I want to know what you think, Nimco. I'm really struck by, and I feel torn by this. I sort of actually have strong feelings about what I think about Edward Colston, but I'm really drawn by your argument, which says, hang on a second, we're going to put so much energy into this argument, which, if you like, is a sort of safe one. It doesn't demand anything of us. We don't have to increase our tax spend, you know, to commit, you know, aid money. We don't have to change our laws, our leadership. Do you watch this whole argument and think, actually, this is one of those arguments that is cultural and therefore actually makes a lot of signaling demands on people, but no actual demands on them? Or what do you feel as you hear this discussion go on?
Yeah, no, I do, and I think it's great that and this is what I mean is, one of my friends the other day said she wanted to do something good and give her time to help young Black people that wanted to get into midwifery, and then she ended up tweeting about it. She asked me to retweet it, and I did, and then she got a lot of backlash where people saying stop virtue signaling and all these things. And then she bombarded me with messages of trying to make her feel better. And I had to reply and say, I don't really have the energy to ease your guilt. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing is that if we want to be able to do better, we have to learn from history, and we have to, like, you know, ensure that we create like a better platform for people. And that's the reality, is the fact that it makes you feel more uncomfortable to deconstruct the international development aid angle, which you think it's so great to give 14 billion a year to people, which I can tell you as an African, it's not helping us the way that it's structured at the moment. Then bring it down a statue. So the reality is, take down the statue if it makes you feel good. Talk about it over your dinner tables, but please do not absorb the only platforms of media where we can make conversations about. It's 5 years since the Yazidi women who are still missing were taken and have been sexually enslaved. The Syrian war is still going on. It's like, I really don't care about a statue that does not have any direct impact on my life on a day-to-day basis. So great, feel bad about it, but don't consume the space that we could be talking about real things that actually matter to Black people, which the death of and police brutality is that. Let's talk about that in America. Let's talk about, like, you know, racism within the UK. Let's talk about, like, you know, the microaggressions on a day-to-day that I don't get offended by but are offensive. So let's talk about real things that we can change. But those things actually, ironically, are things that white people can do things about, but that would mean challenging your own friends and challenging the well-meaning white people. So
okay. Nimco, I think that's a great previous. I'd like to bring in my colleague Luke, who works on our indexes, the Tortoise Intelligence business. Luke, if you can join us. The reason is, Luke wrote a line in the chat which I thought sort of perfectly summed up what I would instinctively feel about this, which was, this is about the tearing down of the Colston statue, which was, for now, it is definitively vandalism, but it's also morally defensible, and I would have been proud to play a part in it. Luke, what do you think about the acts of symbolism and how they, whether you see them as necessary, as a precondition, if you like, to the acts that Nimco is talking about that make a difference in real lives lived now?
Well, I think that's a really good question, and what I've seen in sort of taking part in some of the protests over the past few days is that the acts of symbolism are massively important. The story that's being kind of crafted around the movement is the one that is going to inspire and motivate young people to educate themselves about the practical stuff. There's really no calculating how impactful it is for young people to watch on the news what happened in Bristol. And I think protests and progress towards greater equalities always involved a tension between authority and the movement itself. I mean, you see this in the way that some of the people have become involved in violence against the police, and there has to be a condemnation, but there also has to be respect for not only the kind of moral instincts of the people involved, but also the fact that people are very angry and very frustrated. And unless we give expression to that, younger people who are still coming to an understanding about this, are probably going to be blinkered or going to be cowed by what happens rather than inspired, I think.
And Luke, what do you do? Because I'm sure you also sympathise with the point that Nimco's making, which is, yes, fine, these things are really important. They are statements about what we prize in our culture, but we have got a world of problems, literally a world of problems to deal with. And while we're having these debates, while we're having these protests, it's really hard to get the airspace for that conversation at all. Yeah. How do you make the link from one to the other?
Well, I think people tend towards doing what they can and what's within their sphere of influence. And so we did some leafleting over the weekend that was about getting specific and getting active in your sphere of influence. So we were writing to teachers about the extent to which they could support children to learn. But we were saying to people who are not involved in education, maybe you could speak to your MP and work out what's going to be done to support youth community centres that overwhelmingly do provide support to BAME people once the pandemic is eased. Like, there's been no explicit plan for how that's done for the government. So I think the people in Bristol, maybe they'd been involved in the movement to bring Colston down for a long time, and that was their sphere of influence. That was the area they could act in. There are other people, maybe, I mean, there's a charity called Dimensions that work with people with learning disabilities and disabled people of colour, and their sphere of influence is around policy making in that arena. And I think the specific acts that we take, we shouldn't kind of discredit one because it's taking space from another. There is enough motivation and passion out there, and I think it's impossible to create that hierarchy to argue that one thing
But you can't do one thing because you have to do the other thing.
Precisely, yeah.
I see that. Luke, thank you. Listen, I'm going to. There are non people with their hands up. I want to come to John Alexander because I'm interested in his point about deliberative democracy and that. But I just want to go back to Hannah Rose Woods, because we started talking, Hannah, and then we sort of started getting some context around 1895 and what it all means, and then we were just sort of snowballed into where we are now. So tell me a little bit, when you're listening to this conversation, what you think should be the way in which we approach our cultural history?
I mean, I kind of did want to come in on this kind of question of where will it end and what do we do when we kind of give people permission to destroy private property. And I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the cultural history of protest itself, because I think there is like a real unevenness in what we're calling history in this debate, that, you know, statues are history, but somehow protest is ahistorical or destroying history in kind of one vision of this argument. But I think we also need to remember that there is a strong history, you know, globally, but especially in Britain, of working class protest and also rioting. Because I think this throws up questions about the social contract, and it's perhaps more helpful to conceptualize things in that way. You know, I think no one is arguing that in giving people permission to tear down a statue, they're saying, well, you can tear down whatever you want now, or you can burn buildings, where will it end? And no one's saying that, but I think this is fundamentally, the Black Lives Matter movement is fundamentally about a failure of the social contract. Yeah. That justice is being weaponized against Black people. And, you know, if your social contract is failing you, you know, why do we expect people to uphold their end and to kind of hold all private and or public property, you know, as kind of untouchable, you know, sanctified stuff? You know, I mean, historians talk about the moral economy of crowds and protests, and you know, we could choose to talk about kind of mob rule, but, you know, crowds have a logic to themselves. You know, throughout history, you know, people have erupted into kind of violent protest and riot, but the targets of their destruction were very specific and followed a kind of internal logic of what was proportionate. And I think if we're talking about people that have been historically repressed and continue to be victims of structural racism, And they have tried and tried within normal democratic kind of law-abiding ways to change things, and nothing is happening. If the worst that is happening is that they're tearing down one statue of a slave trader, that seems like a really proportionate amount of civil disobedience to me. That seems extraordinarily restrained.
Yes. And actually, Hannah, it's interesting, you know, Sam Houston, and Sam comes to a lot of our thinking digitally and in our newsroom, makes the point, of course, there is a connection, that the protests in the United States are leading to a very real discussion about defunding of police forces, police reform itself. And so I just wondered whether or not you think that there is a link between cultural history and then, if you like, legislative or economic history.
Sorry, could you just repeat? I lost you.
Whether you think there's a link between the tearing down of statues and then what you know politicians end up doing, whether or not actually what we're seeing happening in Bristol, or saw happening in Bristol, now happening in Oxford, protests coming in London, will actually have a real impact on what happens amongst lawmakers and businesses and society more generally.
Well, I hope so. I hope it is a reminder that, you know, they are there to serve society, and if they're not serving society, the social contract will inevitably break down. That is a direct consequence of their actions. And I, you know, certainly hope, you know, they will realize that, you know, this isn't going to stop at one statue of Edward Colston, but they've been given a perfect opportunity to make change with that in a way that has hurt no one.
Yeah. Well, Hannah, thank you. I'm going to. There are a bunch of people who've got their hands up, and I'm going to try and come to you if I might run. There's John Alexander, I can see, Nico MacDonald. So, John, I know you've had your hand up for a while, and the conversation's moved, so it may have moved on. But what's on your mind?
I guess the thing I wanted to chip in was maybe a bit of a social psychology perspective, a kind of. And one of the concepts that I'm really struck by in all of my work, and it's sort of showing up a little bit differently in this, is the idea of the narrative environment. So that the sort of the story we tell ourselves about who we are and how that manifests in the kind of the physical environment that we live in and the symbolism that we surround ourselves with. And I think I think that the statue seen as a part of a sort of a story we tell ourselves about who we are is potentially an interesting way to think about this. And then I think, but then for me, sort of that where I've come at this concept of narrative environment from is really sort of having worked in the advertising industry for a decade and asking what the role of that is in the world, and being involved in sort of several priming experiments, for example, where if you show people, if you expose people to a bunch of advertising before asking them questions about environmental and social motivation, they're then less likely to exhibit pro-social and pro-environmental motivation. And you're like, what is the story we're telling ourselves about who we are? And how does that, to something Luke was saying, sorry, this is a little bit jumbled, but that's the nature of these things, I guess. Something Luke was saying about people tend to try and affect what's in their sphere of influence. I think we have in this country in particular quite a contracted idea of what our sphere of influence is. And the sorts of work I get very excited about are kind of, what if we think of ourselves as citizens rather than just as consumers? What if we think of ourselves as participants in shaping the public discourse and shaping the narrative environment, rather than simply as kind of private individuals who can only affect our immediate circumstance? And that's where you then get to ideas about, like, how might deliberative democracy, citizens' assemblies, kind of open idea generation be a way of a mayor, for example, saying, okay, how do we want to face our racial history, Bristol? What could we do? What should we do? What do you want to do? And how could we sort of bring that together and face into it? And that's just doesn't seem to be a story of self that's very visible in our political culture.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most interesting things about this, John, has been, you know, those people who said, look, you know, you can have an argument about vandalism, but we've been talking about Edward Colston's statue in Bristol for years and years and years, and there's something about that which is exactly to your point about how the nature of our government, or particularly our local government, is, and more to the point, isn't working. Thank you. I'm going to bring in Nico if I can, and I'd like to see if I could bring in Jenny McCulloch as well in a moment, if she's up for speaking, just because I think that there's some things about leadership in our country, in our businesses, institutions, and effective leadership rather than, you know, ornamental leadership that really matters. So Nico first, and then if I might, I come to Jenny too.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks,
yeah, I want to agree with Rachel in the chat that that the statues have highlighted a lack of education and knowledge about slavery and colonialism, but I think in a slightly different way. I don't think we should be, I mean, I'm not against statues being removed, but I think it's a kind of know-nothingness about this act that bothers me, because I don't think the people doing this act are interested in our education and our learning. They've decided that these people are bad, as if history, you know, is made up entirely of bad people and good people, which it isn't. And they're not interested in trying to put them in the context of their time. So, for instance, there's been no society which hasn't gone through a period of slavery. You know, ancient Greece, which we laud, you know, was a slave society. And there's an inevitability about human socioeconomic progress where, unfortunately, but there it is, slavery is part of how we develop. And they're not interested in actually asking the question about even why Britain chose to abolish the slave trade in 1807. And, you know, although I don't want to be cynical about Britain's motivations, this was the height of the Napoleonic Wars, and France was a significant slave-using society, not least in Hispaniola, now San Domingo, what's now Haiti, and the DR. And it was a, you know, essentially an act of war against, economic war against France. You know, also Britain had industrially moved on, where slavery was not the prevailing economic system, wage labour was, and that was actually a more suitable system for the British Empire. But no one wants to understand this, and I think by removing these statues, we actually remove the opportunity to have a debate about them. And I think we should be, when we see these statues, whether we're black or white or South Asian or any race, we should be saying, we've superseded you people. You know, you didn't win. We're more civilized than you were. And we want to understand why you were like you were. And I think, you know, I'm Caucasian, but I think it's quite reasonable to say that anybody, even if they're more connected with slavery than I am, should be able to be grown up and mature and want to learn about these things and to be able to take that point of view.
Nico, thank you. I'm going to bring in, I don't know what Jenny McCulloch, I could bring you in too. Jenny, because I was just interested about your point about representation on boards and this debate about how you actually put people in places where they can get things done, and the difference between that and how it looks as though you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I was just thinking about Nimco's point about, and out of all the focus on the statue itself, distracting attention from what we could and should be doing now. And that reminded me of a point that was made in a ThinkIn last week about how the idea of getting underrepresented people onto boards is a distraction and we should just junk that. But thinking about it more, I think that is something that we should be thinking about, but thinking about more deeply. So not sort of a kind of tokenistic gesture to get exceptional people onto boards, but ask why aren't they out there already? What stops them from getting access to organisations to begin with, and then to making progress, and really ask what is wrong with governance in big organisations, whether it's commercial sector or in universities, and how we appoint boards, and does it come back to the so the research that's been done into interviewing as a way of appointing people to posts where there's evidence that there's bias, that people on panels are more likely to favour people who look and sound like them.
Well, that's a whole. You're exactly right, and there's a whole question here, isn't there, around what is the actual representation that makes a difference in boards and institutions.
I mean, I think it feeds into the work that you're doing on the index.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I'm going to we've got a couple of minutes left, and I just want to come back, if I can, to Hannah and then finally to Nimco. Hannah, if you were appointed, right, and I'm going to take, because I'm from London, so that's my city. If you were going to take London and say, right, I'm now the cultural historian in charge of the city, I am going to make some decisions about the statues that stay and go, the street names that stay and go, taking on Nico's point that the world is complicated and people aren't purely one thing or another. How would you go about it?
Yeah, absolutely. The world is complicated, and frankly, I do not want to be the person put in charge of state-based iconoclasm. It's not, I think, necessarily a role that historians should take on. I think we can be the ones, you know, on the sidelines, kind of jabbing people in the side, saying, no, the past is both stranger and more familiar than you think it is. You know, we are not here to offer clear-cut lessons, pointing to things in the past and saying that teaches us what we should do now. You know, that is just not, as I see it, a role of historians. What I think I can do here is kind of complicate some of the big narratives that we have about the past. I don't necessarily think it's true that, you know, Britain had kind of economically lost the need for slavery because it had moved to a kind of wage laboured economy. You know, for a very long time after Britain had abolished the slave trade, companies continued to, you know, invest in other countries' trade. You know, people indirectly profited from it for years. You know, we only finished in, I think it was 2015, the Treasury only finished paying off the loan that had been given to bail out slave owners to bring Britain to a point where it did abolish the slave trade. You know, I just think we're in real danger. I do completely agree that we need to move beyond this kind of hero worship of, are people good or bad? Can we cancel them or put them on a pedestal? You know, I really don't think we should be supporting people in history as though they're our football team. I don't know if I have strong feelings about statues either way, but when other people do and want them gone and nothing is done about it, I do then have strong feelings about that.
Yeah, exactly. I picked up exactly on John's point. Thank you, Hannah. And Nimco, just finally, what would you like, just picking up on the point that Luke made, that these things can connect, that you can actually push the feelings that you've got that are launched by what's happening culturally into action on several fronts. What would you like to see happen next?
No, I can kind of get that kind of connection where it's like, I think every generation has its moment of awakening, and I'd like to just kind of come back to what Nico said in the sense that that we have, like, you know, superseded ourselves. We have not superseded ourselves to the time when these men were owning slaves. There are people enslaving people in London today, and for me, that's the reality. I just want us to know, I want us to stop having this superiority as though we are better humans today in the 21st century than we were 300 years ago. We have the opportunities to actually really free people from slavery today, but we're not choosing to do that. We're choosing to look back in history and have this academic conversation and judgmental and moral objection to a statue, and not really. So if I was given the opportunity to do something today, I would actually invest in the Human Trafficking Act. I would actually invest in really bringing trafficking to an end today and really be conscious about that. So this idea of the fact that we are better in the 21st century where we have more opportunities than any other time, but yet we're still enslaving people in the capital city of the United Kingdom, that for me is why I am really irritated by us talking about a statue and not us being conscious about like the chain of the things that we buy on a day-to-day basis, about who's bringing our stuff to our doors, who's making these stuff. We have to be conscious about that. And I think, ironically, that starts with looking at who is in power. And for me at the moment, like, China is a bigger issue than 300 years ago what the UK did, for me as an African. So I think I would just like to leave that with people to say, as we think about 300 years ago, I'm sure, like, you know, 3 minutes down the road in the city of London, that there is somebody probably living through the experience of slavery right now. Yeah.
Nimco, thank you. When we started Tortoise, you know, this was the sort of the classic idea of the ThinkIn, was that you would take a subject that people were arguing about and try and listen to lots of points of view and come to a better informed opinion. And often we'd find that we came to the beginnings of a conversation and it wasn't clearer, or it would tip us off to investigate a story. I think there'd be people who listen to this and say both of those things were true today. For what it's worth, actually, I come away with two really strong and clear thoughts from this discussion. And each in their own way, I think they're invigorating in the way in which I found last week's conversation about the murder of George Floyd and what was happening in the US made me profoundly uncomfortable and forced me to look at questions of privilege and power. This week, actually, I've come away and thought, okay, well, I can see something constructive that comes out of this. And I suppose the 2 points I would come away with are these. One is, on the statues point, there is a difference between history and our story. And actually, if we want to understand the complexities of history, statues are not that. Statues do not illuminate what actually happened, right? In fact, what's really missing is a need for us to have a much more granular understanding in our schools, in our museums, more broadly in our education system about what actually happened. That's history. Our story is the way in which we keep on, generation by generation, decade by decade, reinventing, reevaluating our history and prizing those things that matter to us now. Those are our values. And it makes sense to me that our statues and our public spaces should be reflective of that. And that makes sense. It's true in lots of other places. It should be true in ours. So I sit with Luke then on the, yes, it was an act of vandalism, but it was morally defensible and I'd have been proud to be a part of it. And I take Hannah's point about actually a sort of proportionality here, given the problems we're dealing with. And then the area where I was most surprised in listening to the conversation was listening at the first to Nimco. I thought, God, we're going to fall into this trap where we're going to spend all of our time talking about a statue of someone who's dead a long, long time ago, when real people are really suffering now. And it's easier, if you like, more entertaining to talk about a cultural issue than a real one. And I have to say, this conversation made me much more hopeful about that, and the realization that there is a link between culture and power, that the cultural arguments we have today propel us into real conversations about the distribution and use of power. And so I come away thinking, well, if we address the fact about what we're willing to ignore in our history, if we recognize a debt to our history, then that will play out in terms of power. It plays out in our own conversations at Tortoise about the people that we work with, the stories that we cover, our own editorial agenda, picking up on Lucy Hoodman's point. But I also think there are real world consequences to this. There's the point, Nimco, that you make about, is it going to force us to focus on aid spending and lives in Africa? Is it going to force us to redouble our efforts to deal with slavery now? Is it going to force us to engage in some really big and difficult conversations about reparations, right? Something that people have been fearful of debating, but in the US it seems it's going to be a much more timely and vigorous debate, and arguably in the UK too. Is it going to make changes, as Jenny was just touching upon, about leadership in business and institutions? Is it, as Luke pointed out, going to make a point about education and the system of education? So I come away from this seeing a connection between what we talk about culturally and what happens in the use of power. And so in this particular case, I think there is an opinion that you could come out with that we at Tortoise would be comfortable at least to have a first draft of, that makes the distinction between history and our story and the link between culture and the exercise of power. And so all I can say really is thank you. It's been a really invigorating, as I suppose you can see, conversation, and really forced me to think about what I think. It wouldn't have been possible, frankly, without you, Nimco, really kicking things off, and you, Hannah, giving us some real context and some history about our current history. But to everyone who's weighed in, thank you. That's massively interesting and helpful. We have, believe it or not, another ThinkIn at 6:30 this evening, where we're talking about how we change our behavior with Cass Sunstein, who was President Obama's Director for Information and Regulatory Affairs in the White House, but known to many of us as the co-author of the book on nudge. So there are other ways to change behavior, and nudge is one of them. We'll learn more about it at 6:30. But for now, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. Nimco, Hannah, thank you very much, everyone. We'll wave you all goodbye.